In the modern world, toilet paper is so ordinary that we barely notice it. Soft, scented, clean, always there when we need it. We go, we wipe, we flush, and the memory disappears. But if you were suddenly dropped into the streets of medieval Europe, that simple, private act would become an ordeal. There were no rolls, no soft paper, no guaranteed privacy. Wiping your backside was a matter of improvisation, survival, and surprisingly often, danger. Toilet paper, as we know, it didn't exist in Europe. The Chinese had been producing a primitive form for centuries, but it never made its way west until much later. In the Middle Ages, people reached for whatever was close at hand. Scraps of old cloth, handfuls of hay, bundles of soft moss, broad leaves from the nearest tree, pieces of animal fur, and sometimes, if nothing else was available, their bare hands. Each option came with risks. A scrap of cloth might be filthy from its last use. Hay could be rough enough to scratch the skin. Moss stayed damp, becoming a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. And those who resorted to leaves sometimes learned too late that they had chosen plants that burned or poisoned the skin. The wealthy handled the problem in style. A French duke in the 14th century reportedly carried fine linen squares embroidered with gold thread, used once and burned immediately afterward. Italian nobles favored silk cloths soaked in rose water, kept in ornate wooden boxes by their servants. These were not just tools for hygiene, they were symbols of refinement, a way to remind guests that even in the latrine, nobility lived better than anyone else. A nobleman's choice of wiping cloth could become a talking point at banquets, whispered about with equal parts envy and disgust. For the poor, the experience was far less elegant. A peasant in winter might grab a frozen clump of straw from the barn, or a handful of dry grass meant for the animals. In summer, they turned to large leaves or moss, hoping for comfort, but sometimes grabbing something dangerous. In the far north, some desperate farmers even used dried fish skins. The scales acted like sandpaper, scraping the skin raw and leaving wounds that could quickly become infected. City life brought its own horrors. Communal latrines were a common feature-long benches with holes over a cesspit. In many of these, there was a single spongia, a wooden stick wrapped in cloth, left soaking in a bucket of vinegar or salty water. In theory, the vinegar was meant to disinfect. In reality, it masked the smell, but did little to kill disease. Every person in the latrine used the same stick, dipping it back between turns, sharing far more than they realized. One 14th century account from England tells of an inn where disaster struck overnight. More than half the guests fell violently ill within hours. The culprit was the communal wiping stick. A traveler with dysentery had used it earlier in the evening, contaminating the brine. By morning, the latrine had become a silent killer, striking down anyone unlucky enough to have sat there after him. The inn closed within days, its reputation ruined. Not all disasters were about disease. Some were about insult. In 15th century France, a drunken tenant farmer stumbled into his lord's manor after nightfall. He needed to relieve himself, and in his stupor, grabbed the nearest soft cloth. Unfortunately, it was an embroidered towel bearing the noble family's coat of arms. By dawn, the man was shackled. His crime wasn't trespassing, it was dishonoring the family's crest. The punishment was brutal and humiliating. A public flogging, followed by a full year of cleaning the manor's latrines. Even the cloistered life of monks was not free from the perils of medieval hygiene. A German monastery once suffered a strange plague of stomach illnesses and worm infestations. The cause was traced to the bundles of moss and straw the monks used for wiping. They were washed occasionally, but never well enough. Over time, they became a breeding ground for parasites. The abbot eventually ordered every bundle burned and banned moss from the latrines entirely. In some regions, there were even laws about what you could and couldn't wipe with. Fabric was valuable, and wasting it on such a purpose could be a punishable offense. Historical records from Flanders describe servants being fined or whipped for cutting up household linens for personal use. One young maid was caught tearing strips from her mistress's dowry sheets. Her explanation, to keep herself clean, earned her no sympathy. She was beaten in the marketplace as a warning to others. Hygiene was also a way for nobles to flaunt their status. Count Lorenzo Lucchesi of Italy was infamous for his perfumed wiping cloth, kept in a silver box and carried by a dedicated servant. The cloth was washed after every use in imported lavender water from Provence. Local peasants joked that the Count's backside smelled sweeter than his breath, but they also recognized it as a sign of his untouchable privilege. For common folk, the dangers extended beyond insult or embarrassment. In rural Norway, a tale still told today speaks of a hunter who made the mistake of wiping with stinging nettles. The swelling, burning, and blistering kept him from walking properly for days, and the villagers teased him mercilessly. Nettle patches in the region are still jokingly called the hunter's revenge. In the poorest areas, there was often nothing at all to wipe with. People used their hands and rinsed in the nearest river or stream. But those waters were frequently contaminated with human waste from upstream latrines. Instead of cleaning themselves, people sometimes walked away with far more dangerous gifts: cholera, dysentery, or parasitic infections. What medieval people didn't realize was that wiping wasn't just about comfort, it was about life and death. In crowded towns, a single contaminated cloth or shared wiping stick could spread illness faster than almost anything else. The latrine was, in its own way, as dangerous as the battlefield. And yet, even in this most private of acts, the divisions of class were obvious. Nobles could indulge in soft, perfumed cloths, servants to wash or burn them, and private facilities. The poor squatted over pits, scraping themselves with whatever came to hand, and lived with the risk of infection every single day. The next time you unroll a clean, fresh sheet of toilet paper, think about the centuries of discomfort, disease, and indignity that came before it. Be grateful that you live in an age where wiping is quick, private, and safe, where no one will ever hand you a vinegar-soaked stick and expect you to share it with the entire neighborhood.